I'm Miriam. I do things on the web, and we'll talk about some of them. Great. So we're going to talk about CSS layout because there's a lot of new shit and there's a lot of old shit that people are still using, and there's good reasons to use the various things. So let's start with tables. Did anybody here start on the web when tables were? Wow, yeah, good. I think I did some tables in college, but never on a production site. So, great. Back when I was a kid, yeah. So this is me, I think, starting Oddbird with my brothers. I guess I have a pixie cut or something. I don't know. This is a table. That's not what we're talking about. So we're talking about this. I got this old screenshot that looks like it's some pixelated old text editor because, you know, that felt right. And this slide from Dominique's talk of flipping tables, because this was shit. So tables, obviously a hack, but it was the only layout technique at the time. This was when before CSS and right when CSS was starting. And the entire layout lives in the markup and in a very structured way in the markup. So no matter what order the content would make sense in, you have to follow the order of the table. There's limited styling, strict markup, accessibility is shit, and the whole thing is just a nightmare. Eventually we got past that. Hey, look, CSS. So we're going to focus more on the CSS stuff because even the first things that came around in CSS are still what we're using. And we finally separate presentation from markup. And you've all seen this, right? And I promise you this is a feature. If you tell the browser to give you this font size, this font, and a small square, what do you want it to do? Of course it's giving you this. It's letting you decide. So this is a feature. CSS allows you to do this. It also allows you to cut it off or wrap it or do some other things. There's a lot of different ways you can solve this supposed problem. But the point here is this box, the web doesn't quite work in the way that we're used to thinking in print. What went wrong here is we got too explicit about too many details, and that doesn't work. We have to define relationships. So we have to say, okay, if the font gets bigger, let the box get bigger. Or if the box gets smaller, here's what to do with the text. Instead of just setting everything explicitly and letting it break. So we got to describe the relationships between things, and that often means leaving out height, so that the height flexes well. I mean, I remember an early talk in 2008 from somebody saying, fear of heights is a good thing in CSS. Avoid that height property. And we want to design flexible systems that are ready to change based on the browser, the content, the viewport, and any other context. So taking one widget and putting it in a different place, it's able to flex to that size. And we all know this. We've been doing responsive design now for what, like 5 years? Oh yeah, so here's Moxie telling us all about all the different screen sizes. I like referencing earlier talks. So one of the key things that I try to remind people on my team when we're doing layouts is that whenever we can, we want to stay in the flow. Because the flow is what gives us relationships between objects. And as soon as we leave the flow, objects lose their relationships. And let's look at what that means. So here is These are 3 floated divs, and if we resize them, you can see how the flow works. The other objects move around to fill space. And we can control this in different ways with more CSS, but the point is, when our sidebar gets bigger, say, other things can move to make room. And that's a good thing. We want things to be in the flow so that they can affect each other. As soon as we take it out of the flow, you make your sidebar bigger, suddenly you have to make your content a different size. Everything is tightly coupled, and we're trying to control everything at once. And that's when things start to break down. So staying in the flow is a good idea. And now let's look at some of the ways that we can do it. Where's this? But first, fix the box model. This is something that IE got right the first time. And then when CSS came out, they followed the spec, which was the right thing to do, but the spec is wrong. The box model is this. By default, the width and height of an element define the content width and height, and then padding and borders and margin are all added to that. And when you're doing layout, that's extremely confusing because you really want to be able to control the outer edges. We can do that now as of IE 7 or something. So for a few years, where we can set the total width and height and let the padding and borders be removed from it. And I do that on every site first thing with this line of CSS, which is just take everything and make it border box. And now that's the default. There are good reasons we may want to use content box in the future. I think sometimes when we're making containers for a site, we really want to know the inner width there and then add some padding to it. So there are reasons to switch back, but this is a better default. I've seen some people do it this way, where you're setting it on the HTML element and then inheriting it everywhere, and I think that's a terrible idea. There's reasons certain elements don't inherit by default. We don't want backgrounds to inherit. We don't want height or width to inherit. We don't want anything related to the layout of an object to inherit, because something doesn't lay out like its parent. So when we flip the box model on something, we don't want that to trickle down to everything else inside. This is a fragile way to go, because it assumes that children of parents work the same way, and that's not reliable. All right, so going through, when I first started CSS, it seemed like layouts were probably going to be relative positioning, right? I mean, this seems like I want to position things in a layout. Let's try it. It doesn't do anything. You can like nudge the thing around a bit, and it has no effect on the rest of the objects. Relative positioning being relative to the default position of the object. So that's off the table as a layout technique. Has anybody used relative positioning for something other than creating a context? No. No. It's for creating context. Creating context for absolute positioning. Because absolute positioning is relative to the earliest ancestor with non-static positioning. And so adding position relative to something makes it a good context. But absolute and fixed, those also seem like they would be options, and I've seen people try. We're actually working on an old site right now that was built in Google Web Toolkit. Has anybody used that? It tries to position everything absolutely on your site. I don't. But that's also a problem, because suddenly we've pulled it out of the flow. It no longer has any relationship to anything else on the page, and we can't sort of push things around with relationships. We have to be explicit about everything. And fixed position is similar but relative to the viewport instead of to an ancestor. Those are great for overlays, drop downs, anything that isn't in the flow, that we don't want to be part of a layout, something that is over top of the layout. Those work great. So CSS floats, that's sort of where we end up. at least back when I was starting out, and still a lot of us today. Floats were built to do this, and they do it great. You can take bare images and put them to the left or the right of lower pixel text. What else would you want? And it kind of flows. Flows are interesting because, like, it's kind of pushing things out of the way, and it's kind of not. They're sort of in the flow, and they sort of create their own context. We can resize this, and you see that some things are being pushed, and some things aren't. And that's because this one is also floated, and this one is not floated. So there's sort of this weird logic around when floated elements relate to each other and when they don't. For that container that's collapsing, you need a clear fix. We've all seen these. We all have some sort of utility with a clear fix. Now you can also use display flow root, and by you can also use, I mean you can barely use. So now that we're stopping this tradition of using flows for layout, you can finally, like, grid has better support than flow root. So good luck with this one. Still fun, great. They're learning. Overflow hidden hack is really interesting if you're using floats. It helps with creating fluid columns and containers. You can use overflow hidden instead of a clear fix. The danger is the overflow is hidden. But now with overflow hidden on both this next object and on the container, both of those now act as positioning contexts, part of the flow. And this is one way that you can, with floats, make a static column and a fluid column. Because wherever this one adjusts, that one will, whereas another floated element won't be fluid with it. So clever hack, but dangerous if you've got anything that's going to go outside. The other thing I love about floats is they don't care about nesting. Because the containers collapse, you can have all sorts of divitis from the JavaScript. I hate how the JavaScript frameworks are always giving me divs I don't want. So if any of you are JavaScript devs, fix it. But with floats, that doesn't matter because we can just nest divs all we want, and they'll just collapse out of the way, and we can take elements that are not siblings and float them next to each other. That's pretty cool. There used to be this issue with subpixel rounding, and I don't know if anybody's still dealing with this in browsers. We haven't in a while much. This is what it used to be like. I think this is from 2008, an article by John Ressig, showing that if you put percentages on something, they've got to round somehow, and every browser had a different idea of how they should round. That's pretty much been fixed at this point. I don't know of any modern browsers that still have this problem. They all do subpixel rounding. It's fine. But this was a fun world to live in, and we were sort of always putting negative margins on things so that they stay in a row even if it got too much. John Alvin Wilkins came up with this trick for floating, which I think is overkill, and you don't need it very often, but it does an interesting thing. So what he did was put a large negative right margin on every element so that they were all removed from the horizontal flow. It looks like this. Everything has a negative 100% right margin. Basically, all the elements pull back to the left edge, and then you have to push them out to where you want them. And it was an interesting solution to subpixel rounding, because the real problem with subpixel rounding is when you make the same rounding error multiple times, it builds up. And then if you've got 5 items in a row, all rounding down, you end up with 5 pixels at the end of your layout. So this removed that, no pixel rounds, or no item rounds more than 1 pixel, solved. And he built a whole grid system out of that, and we sort of, it's bulky. And at this point, I was playing with, here, if it will let me resize that. Oh, only off. So you can see that at this point, those red lines coming through, that's where we're getting rounding errors. So you can see at this point, isolation does a worse job than the browser. So I just showed it to you while we're using it. It's overkill, but it's an interesting trick. This is one thing that I figured out I could do with it. Because items are removed from the horizontal flow but not the vertical flow, I could stack floats and have the container still wrap all of them. So you get equal height columns, even though, or equal height tabs in this case, even though they don't all have content to fill that. So it's an interesting trick. You might use it some places. I don't recommend it as a full layout technique of its own. Backgrounds, for some reason, do still round boundly. So you can see the white lines there are the perfectly rounded 30 columns, and then the red lines are a background that is rounding at exactly the same percentages. And I have found no way to fix that. Backgrounds just round wrong. So that's why background grids on grid systems often fall apart. Let's talk about grid systems, because that's sort of the next thing that came up. We got Blueprint in 2007. So that's just when I was a little bit into my professional career with this. And it seemed to be the first open source thing that took over the front end world, as I recall. People started using these. So with a grid system like this, you get a bunch of classes, because classes are the only API that CSS really gives you to build open source tools like this. And then each span has a specific width, and you end up doing something like this in your markup, where you're putting in the number of classes to tell it how to fall on the grid. And this seemed nice at the time because layout in CSS was hard, and there were lots of hacks to it. Like every time you floated something, I think it's actually on there. You had to, oh no, it's on the next one. You had to include this displayed inline. You couldn't float something out without saying it was inline, otherwise things would break. There were a bunch of just weird hacks. So these grid systems helped us fix these hacks. But that API is a bit clunky still. This is a little slicker because it puts the gutters on either side, so you don't have a first or last issue. But still looks similar. Then I saw this talk by Natalie Down in 2008. It's still online, and I still think it's one of the best talks I've ever seen. If you have a chance, her CSS systems, a lot of some of the details are out of date, but the concept here is great, and she gives a lot of good hints on how to think about CSS. But a big part of, she was responding to these grid systems, and she was saying, no, what we need is not the same styles on every site, where like this grid system comes in and tells us how every site should work. Every site is 12 columns broken down into these spans. We need ways of thinking about grids that we can take from one project to the next and adjust on the fly and design custom sites. Hers, oh yeah, so here's some of the questions you've got to answer in coming up with a layout, a grid system. Is it going to be static, set in pixels? Is it going to be fluid? And this was before media queries, so responsive was not an option. Static, fluid, elastic, based on ems, so the font size would change it, or some combination. Equal columns or asymmetrical columns. Are you going to do a golden ratio because you believe in magic? Where are you going to put the gutters? Do you have gutters between columns, and where do they live? Are they on the left margin, the right margin, both margins, or in padding? And go with padding every time. I'll show you why. And how's it going to respond? So hers, before responsive design, she had figured out this system that was fairly responsive, just without the media queries, building the inside of her website always with percentages, and then just putting a fixed frame on it if she wanted a fixed frame. And she would often do that with ems, and that meant that it was responding to font size at a time when browsers weren't doing zoom yet. They were actually responding to font sizes. So her sites were responding to font sizes and a max width that kept them in the window, et cetera, et cetera. Very clever. Based on this math to figure out that's out of order. Very, very super flexible, responds to font size and viewport, but this is what the math looked like. And of course, at that time, we didn't have Sass, You couldn't do that math in the browser. So I started using her system, and I started typing those numbers into a calculator every time I had to do a layout. And the result is ugly, because what you get in your code is the final percentage with no explanation. And that's meaningless. So finally SAS did come around, and we hopped on it really quickly and built Suzy. And the whole point was just taking her system idea and giving it a prettier, more meaningful pattern. So you probably don't need grid systems. There's a lot of ways to get around it now. Mostly they're just giving you loaded code that you don't need. So let's look at ways to do that. Kill the margin gutters. The math of a grid system, this math is only difficult because we have gutters in the way. As soon as you take out the gutters, one column of 12 is a 12. And we can do that math easily. We don't need all of this to figure out how many gutters are between the 12 columns and how big are the gutters in relation to the column. So as soon as you get your margin gutters, you don't need a grid system anymore. You can do it in much simpler code. So span 3 of 12, in SAS you can just use percentage 3 over 12. And that's it, there's your grid system. Now you have something that's meaningful. It means 3 columns out of 12, that's what it says. And it's done without any overhead, any grid system at all. In order to do it, you have to get rid of the gutters. So I highly recommend that. That's also the recommendation of something like OOCSS, which was one of the first to start doing a lot of the things we're doing today, whole solvents. You can also do it straight in CSS now with calc. So you can say calc 3 over 12 times 100%, and you've got a grid system. Add variables to that, and suddenly you have even a grid syntax in your code. So this is a CSS variable. You define it, dash dash. That's basically an empty prefix. So we used to have dash webkit something. Dash dash is an empty prefix for your own. You can define them however you want. So here, and they will trickle down in your DOM like other CSS, which is not something that a preprocessor can do. So you can say, add a min width, we want to change how many columns there are, and we want to change the size of the gutter. And then we do some calc magic. It's just the same thing that I showed you before. The span divided by the context times 100%. And we add that to our width. So then in the final, we just say span 1, and it creates the width. And then padding gutters. So that looks like this, which I don't have, let's see. There it is, flexing. So that second one then at 50 ems, which is bigger than this, jumps to a 6-column grid, and they're still all set at 1 out of 6 now. So there's a lot you can do with variables in calc now to replace a grid system. And if you've got your gutters out of the way, there's no need. Also, 12 columns, I don't know, we can do better. So this is my general rule. The rule of CSS layout is to do as little as possible. We don't need a big system. We just really want to push this thing over here and have something flow up next to it. And the less of that we have to be explicit about, the better. We really want things to be able to flow next to each other, and that allows them to flow differently in different places with less overrides. So the less we can do, the better. Inline block grids started coming out around then. There's way too many hacks involved in this. I don't recommend it. You've got to do some weird like font size 0, font size. There's white space that gets in the way, and getting rid of that white space is a hacky pain in the ass. It got us small things like vertical centering. So it's a hack that is maybe useful to know. It's not useful for full layouts. Display table. This one's a little more interesting. This is like halfway to Flexbox. Not quite halfway. But table does give us some things, like there's the same markup. We switch it to table cell, and suddenly they're horizontal and responding to each other. You can set one to the width 40%, and the others will flex to take up the remaining space. And that's sort of like how Flexbox would do the same thing. Flexbox just gives you lots more control over it with less strict markup. So if you can use Flexbox, use Flexbox instead. But tables are an interesting fallback if you're dealing with older browsers. Flexbox. This is the first time we got to play with magic in CSS. So cool. And look at that support. If you're not using Flexbox, complain to your boss. And it's so great. Like, I'm not going to go into detail. There's just so much you can do with Flexbox because you are specifically setting relationships between elements, and you're just telling them where should they start flexing, and then should they be able to get bigger or smaller from there. And then the elements figure out how to arrange based on the rules you've given them, which is what we wanted. Here's a full height equal columns with Flexbox, because we can tell things to flex and grow in relation to each other. We can do this pretty simply. Full height is just this. Have you seen viewport units before? That means it's going to be 100% of the height of the viewport. And if you do that, make sure you set overflow somewhere, because you're going to have things go past that fold, and what happens with them. If you want a sticky footer instead of a full height, you just change that to min height, 100 VH, and then it will never get, your site will never get smaller. And then if you use Flexbox or something, you can make things expand to fit the space that's available. So those are cool little things you can use. And then this one, it's sort of out of nowhere, but for breaking the container, another way you can use calc. So you've got a column of content, like most of our blog posts, that's a limited line length for readability. And then sometimes we want a full width image in the middle of that. Here's your full width image. You do the calc 50%, which takes 50% of the container size, minus 50% of the viewport, and you'll have the right margin automatically calculated for pulling your image out of its container and fitting the viewport perfectly. Flexing is definitely totally magic, and you should definitely be using it. It really is like, it's a replacement for floats in almost every situation that you were using floats, except the places where grid is going to take over. So the main downside is that it's still one-dimensional. What I mean by that is the flow still either goes left to right or top to bottom. There's no, with grid we can start going anywhere we want on 2 dimensions, but flex items are still going to stack up in a wrapping flow. So like floats wrap at the end of the page. That's what happens with Flexbox. It doesn't give us quite as much 2-dimensional control, but it does give us a lot. And as Dominic mentioned earlier today, it's not great for page loads on a full layout. What it is great for is like Nicole Sullivan's media object. You have a lot of control about how this thing moves. If you put it in Flexbox, you can say whether you want the image to stay equal height with the content, or whether it just stays at the top or stays centered, or all sorts of things. So it gives us good layout tools in the flow, which is what I use for a component itself. I'll use Flexbox. Nesting matters again, and that bugs me. They say that we're getting display contents, which will basically just make an element, take it out. It will display its contents and get out of the way, but we don't have that yet. So I don't like that all of my parts of the layout have to be in the same level of markup. And we got CSS grid, which Dominic went over in more detail than I'm going to. So hopefully you saw that. Browser support was like sudden, and most of the browsers. If you're working in modern browsers, we have this almost everywhere. If you're working with older browsers, you can provide a fallback. But still, it does some pretty powerful things that it's worth doing a CSS grid layout and a fallback option that's different. There is absolutely nothing like it. People have talked about it being like tables or something. It is not like tables. There is nothing else in CSS that can do what grids do. There is no grid system out there that can do what grids do. Suzy does absolutely not do what grids do. This tool is way more powerful because it's in the browser and it has access to the DOM and can actually flex things in relation to the viewport. A lot of people get scared away because the spec is very complex. You shouldn't have to read the spec. I was told earlier today, reading the source is not how you're supposed to learn a tool. There's lots of great CSS Tricks has some good overviews, and there's lots of anything by Jen Simmons or Rachel Andrew, and I'll show some of those links later. They have great tutorials on getting started. It's really like this, and it's sort of similar to like declaring your settings in another grid system. And with Suzy 3, we followed this syntax pretty much. You set display grid, and then you can set up the width of the columns and the width of the rows, and any gap between them. You can use this repeat syntax to shorten things by repeating one value multiple times to create, there's a 4-column grid, each column being one fraction. And you can mix any units. You can sort of do this by hand with floats if you use column, but I recommend using grid. You can mix any units, so you can have some columns, some rows are pixels, and some are ems, and some are percentages, and it will all work out fine. Or fractions. This is when you create a grid. So mine said we have 4 columns at 300 pixels and 3 rows at 300 pixels. So we get something like this. The lines are numbered, they're 1 index, so you start with 1 and go to 5. That can get confusing. Because you're like, I want it in the 5th column, then you go to line 4. Wait, the 5th column, no, that would be there. Whatever. It does, when you're playing with it, it at times get confusing. You can also number backwards. So you can say, I want it 1 from the end or 2 from the end, using negative numbers. These are where the gaps go. And I think it's interesting, there's no way right now in CSS Grid to automatically cover, let's say we want to cover 3 columns and then also cover the gap. There's not really a way to do that, except for knowing the size of the gap and using negative margins. But you can create gaps. You can control vertical and horizontal separately. So you can have your gutters back. Grid items, you basically, like you would in a grid system, tell them where to start, tell them where to end. Or tell them where to start and tell them how many to span. And that's basically it. And at that point, you can take any elements of the parent grid and start putting them anywhere on the page you want. And they will all fit. Just a quick overview. Percent values define a fraction of the total space available. So when you use a percentage, that is of the space available. When you use viewport width, that is of the whole viewport, which is often different. When you use the fraction unit, the new fraction unit, that's a fraction of the remaining space. And that's one of the things that we weren't able to do before. Well, Flexbox starts to do that. So that's similar to Flexbox, being able to say, how does this take up remaining space in relation to other things? So the fraction unit is new. Another thing that I've learned the hard way multiple times before I finally remembered it is that when you say 1 fraction, what you are really saying is min-max auto 1 fraction. And what happened, in our blog, we have all these images that are breaking the container. And because it was saying the minimum is the auto size, it was refusing to go small, our grid was refusing to go smaller than those full width images that were inside of it. So it can be useful to say min-max 0 one fraction if you really want something to be able to shrink beyond its content. So this is what we get with that code back there. We have a red and a green, laying them out. They can overlap, that's fine. There's also auto placement. What we probably want is something like this, layout, right? Header, nav, main, footer, something like that. And this is how you do it. Grid template areas, you basically do some ASCII art to define your areas. Like our layout's going to look like this ASCII drawing. And then you can say the size of the columns and the size of the rows, and you're simply assigning each item there to its area of the grid, and it will flow to fill that space. And there you have that in about, well, that was like 8 lines of code. And it doesn't matter what order they're in. They all just fall into place and flow relative to each other. So, boom, 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 boom. You've got a website, you wear your helmet, there's dragons, which is why, oh yeah, there's also this other stuff. There's other stuff, Dominic will tell you about it. He already did, but you weren't listening, so ask him. You can like name lines and stuff. It's very cool. It does all kinds of cool shit. And it's definitely worth learning. It works in 2 dimensions. It is absolutely the first time we have had real layout tools in CSS. And it is seriously real layout tools in CSS. It's not some halfway there thing again.